Well, for more on the summit, we're joined by Tom Switzer. He's a research associate at the US Study Centre and editor of the American Review. Tom, good to see you.
Andrew.
Before we get into the issue of the two leaders meeting, let's talk about government agency surveillance, which is obviously big news. This comes back to the Patriot Act, which was essentially designed to gather information to support specific investigations. Has the US government gone beyond the framework of that
Well,
act?
opinion does vary. I mean, the President himself and his advisors are arguing that what they're doing here is very limited, but it's also legal. So to the extent that that is true, that it is part of the Patriot Act. The problem that the President has is that he's copying criticism from both his liberal left. When you upset the New York Times editorial page, you know you've upset your friends.
Well, you mentioned that. In fact, it's a scathing editorial, isn't it?
Yeah.
Saying, declaring that the Obama administration has now lost all credibility.
Yeah, well, this is one of the many so-called scandals that have taken place in Washington in the last few weeks. We had the Benghazi hearings, and then we had the allegations that the External Revenue Service was picking on conservative groups and Tea Party-aligned groups over their taxes, and then the allegations that the administration was picking on certain journalists, most notably the Associated Press. So this is just one of many. But the point is, it's not just the New York Times and Eugene Robinson at the Washington Post and even MSNBC. It's many conservatives, including Jim Sessenbrenner, who's a distinguished veteran congressman from Wisconsin. He was one of the authors of the Patriot Act, and he says that these allegations that the Guardian newspaper broke a few days ago are more disturbing and actually is more aggressive than the original intent of the Patriot Act.
Yet he's also receiving support from both Liberals and Conservatives.
Yeah, to some extent he is. And I think, in fairness, that an argument could be made. I mean, Andrew Sullivan, who was a strong supporter of the Iraq War, but has since, if you like, been mugged by reality and become the darling of a lot of Liberal Democrats in the blogging community in the United States, he makes the point that this kind of technology that we're talking about is one of America's only competitive advantages against extremists and jihadists. And yes, although its abuses can be terrible, so could the consequences. And I think that's the kind of argument you are hearing from some members of Congress, particularly in the Senate.
Yeah, in fact, reportedly, PRISM, which we're talking about as eavesdropping essentially on the activities of people using the internet, of those major internet companies in the United States, was developed in 2007 under George W. Bush.
That's right. Yeah.
So is that fair criticism that obviously Barack Obama's line is that all measures are necessary to protect the safety of US citizens? It's not terribly invasive because they're not eavesdropping directly on conversations. It's more looking at that metadata.
Look, my own view is that the President's on reasonable ground here to say that this is legal and it's limited. But the problem he has, though, is that this is coming on top of these other crises that have taken place. And now when you have, as I said, the New York Times and Doug Schoen, who was a former Clinton advisor, coming out saying that this government is lacking all credibility, that's the problem, and that's why it's on the political back foot.
What does it mean? He's serving his final term?
Well, look, he is under all sorts of pressure. This administration hasn't got off to a good start in its second term. You've had the problems in Syria, you've had the problems with Benghazi, but also you've had the problems with all these security breaches and allegations of wiretapping and eavesdropping and whatnot. The other point to bear in mind is the economy. Now, many people in America are starting to feel very bullish about the US economy. That could give his administration a new lease on life. The unemployment rate is still pretty sluggish at 7.6%, but nevertheless, most of the trajectory, particularly home ownership, is improving.
Well, and undoubtedly he's also looking for some positive headlines out of his meeting with the Chinese president. What can we expect will eventuate out of this meeting? Is it merely shaking hands, trying to firm up a relationship?
Well, all too often a lot of commentators and historians apply the term historic for these diplomatic discussions, but I think this is one of those few occasions where it could be described as historic. I mean, it's a highly unusual event in that it's very informal, and you're meeting not in the White House or at Camp David, but in a former late philanthropist's estate in Southern California. I think it's also historic in the sense of what's actually happening right now. History shows that the likelihood of a great war will take place when an established leading great power struggles or fails to accommodate the rise of another great power. And both China and America right now have fundamentally incompatible goals about their countries' places in the region. For the Americans, they're increasingly pivoting a lot of resources and military away from the Middle East and towards East Asia. You saw this in late 2011 when the President visited Darwin and championed the US base. And from the Chinese perspective, if its country rises the way that other great powers have risen, including the United States, it makes sense that its definition of national interests will grow as its power increases. And because China is so dependent on energy imports and export-led growth, China's leaders might make a point of ensuring that no other country can deny it access to the resources and markets on which its prosperity and stability depends. So this has all the hallmarks of a potential clash. Distinguished politicians and political analysts and intellectuals like Hugh White at the ANU, who has an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal today, John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, are saying that the scope for a potential conflict is very ripe, and this of course has huge implications for the region. The competing school of thought, of course, is that China, by integrating into the world economy, particularly with the United States, that will pacify any aggressive intent. So we're at a point where the leaders of both countries will help try to end this ruinous cycle of how great power conflicts come into place and reach some sort of mutual accommodation.
Tom Switzer from the US Study Centre, thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew.